There's an old saying that you're probably familiar with: never get too close to your heroes. I grew up in the Gospel Spreading Church of God in Newport News in Hampton, Virginia, as did my mother, grandparents, and great grandparents who were founding members of the Newport News Church. Every week, I was reminded of the enormous impact that our founder had on lives in cities, across the nation, and even across the world. Some knew him as the grandfather of churches. As my research developed, I stumbled upon a New York Times article that would forever remove those rosy tinted lenses and see the man for who he really was, forever changing the direction of this audio biography. This is the story of mega pastor Elder Lightfoot Solomon Mashaw, his rivalry with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and his behind closed doors relationship with J. Edgar Hoover. Three influential men on separate pathways whose worlds would eventually collide. The best place to start is their beginnings. Who were these people before they became influential figures? How were they molded? Our story begins November 7th, 1887, in Newport News, Virginia. Lightfoot Solomon Mashaw was born to Blanche May Mashaw and Henry Mashaw. According to Ancestry.com, John and May roughly had 11 surviving children: Philip Mashaw, Courtney, Colney, Julius Caesar, Norris, Margaret, Benjamin, Jenny, Lightfoot Solomon, Ruth, and Louis Mashaw, also known as Lonnie, a nickname later given to him by his wife. Louis Mashaw would later become a civil rights pioneer, and he is certainly one for the history books, and you'll learn more about him in another chapter. Though Solomon was a middle child, his mother seemed to favor him, giving him the name Solomon. The name of an honorable king meant he was destined for greatness, and Lightfoot as a nod to his Native American identity. Born with a caul, he was. A caul is a thin white veil of embryonic sac that gracefully lays across the baby's face and body after they're born, giving them the appearance of both angelic and holy, a sign that the baby is blessed or destined for greatness. Solomon was born in Newport News around the Reconstruction era of the United States. America was still steadying itself from the aftermath of the Civil War. Many towns were decimated, gradually rebuilding, and in desperate need of work and capital. If there's anything this family of 12 needs right now, it's greatness. And the people of that area really needed jobs. Luckily, there's an ever-expanding job force at the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company, now called Huntington Ingalls, though most locals still to this day just call it the shipyard. This shipbuilding company would provide hundreds of jobs to citizens and help fuel an abundantly growing city. Solomon's father, John, was a successful entrepreneur, running a grocery, produce, and fish market. John is a lighter complexioned man from Jewish, African American, and French heritage. His wife, May, otherwise known as Blanche, is a woman of African descent and is a fairly dark-skinned woman. Unfortunately, in those days, and sometimes even today, colorism played a huge part in finding the right mate. A lighter complexion companion was a way of avoiding certain inequities and mistreatings during this Jim Crow era. At the time, Newport News, Virginia in the 1880s was a highly segregated city, known for redlining and dismantling black neighborhoods, such as the residents of Shoe Lane in Newport News. If you get a moment, feel free to Google Shoe Lane. They were a thriving black community which was unrightfully dismantled to make room for Christopher Newport University. Now, John, being of Jewish descent, plays well and earns him favor with both white and Jewish business owners. There are some that would say that John's business tactics were a bit unsavory and questionable. Apparently, he would pass some of this down to his son, which we'll get into later. The family tethers between Baptist and Presbyterian, but ultimately wanted to be around the upper class of black society, so they attend First Baptist Church on Jefferson. Lightfoot was a student at the 22nd Street Negro School, also known as the John Marshall Elementary School, a historical elementary school that still stands today. Solomon was a bright and gifted child. He wasn't very social and usually kept a small group of white friends and a few black ones as well. As a child, Solomon seemed to draw to his calling early. He was well known for having visions of holy angels that only he could see, a story told to me many times by a longtime member of the Newport News Church. When others would enter the room, these holy angels would disappear, only to return when he was alone. His mother would ask, "Who are you talking to?" "The angels, mother." This solidified her faith that her son was destined for far more. His father, John, saw potential in him as well, but in a much different way. John decided to give him the task of being a pushcart salesperson for the family grocery and fish market, located near Jefferson Avenue and 22nd Street. Now, this is a predominantly African American neighborhood, and some would describe it as a bit rugged. To run the family business, certain sacrifices are made, and Solomon had to drop out of school around the 4th grade and was homeschooled. Now, again, Solomon is of lighter complexion. His father owns a thriving business, and they rub elbows with the up-and-comers of their area. Things are pretty good. He sees the struggles that many black families go through, but his world is generally unaffected. He has developed a certain air about himself. This confidence, this air, plays very well with his father as he decides to expand the family business into different neighborhoods, including the predominantly white historic North End, otherwise known today as Huntington Heights. He pushes his little seafood cart up and down the road, ignoring the elements, knocking on doors of strangers of white families to expand Dad's business. The residents of Huntington Heights took a liking to Solomon. John and Solomon notice from a young age that there's something different about him, something that makes certain people of non-color feel comfortable around him. At this point, his father's business explodes, and Solomon notices it. This is where Solomon thinks, yeah, I'm going to accomplish something. I just have to develop my navigation techniques. Right around 1904, at the age of 19, Solomon opens his own business. If you guessed a seafood and grocery business, you'd be spot on. I mean, why change the formula? He's already established a network of new clients in Tony neighborhoods, and his second business is a dance studio. Right around the same time Solomon's businesses are growing, his mother suffers a nervous breakdown. This could be due to a number of reasons, but there are some that point the finger at how Mae Mashaw was treated by her husband. Mae was a fairly dark-skinned woman, and John typically kept his wife out of sight. The less she was around, the more opportunities John saw to rub shoulders with prominent business owners, prominent white business owners. While John attended functions With the upper crust of society and their wives, John saw fit to tell his wife to stay home, hiding May away throughout the years of their marriage while he expanded his influence. She was sent to the Central Lunatic Asylum for the Colored Insane at Howard's Grove in Petersburg, Virginia. This would later become the Central Lunatic Asylum. Just up the road from the asylum is Fort Lee in Hopewell, Virginia. While visiting his mother in Petersburg, Solomon, being the salesman that he is with a little time on his hands, decides to knock on the door at Fort Lee to see what he can drum up. At the height of World War I, he signs a contract with Fort Lee, feeding 60,000 hungry soldiers and commanders at the 80th Division, also known as the Blue Ridge Division. This is very good timing for Solomon. He sets up government contracts in Petersburg, Newport News, and Norfolk Naval Station, the world's largest naval station. Now, as I mentioned, Solomon, as well as his father, had some rather unusual business tactics. Fresh green peas were often requested in their government food contracts. The only problem is keeping fresh peas year-round is quite a task for any business. According to a dissertation of Dr. Lillian Eason Ashcraft, Michal once said, "I put out every scheme I could." He added green food dye to the can of dried peas, giving the appearance of fresh green peas. Nevertheless, the government didn't notice and continued the lucrative contract. Business was booming, and Solomon was renting storage cabinets with a storage capacity of over 2 million pounds. That's a lot. Things were really rolling along for Solomon. Money's coming in, and he starts saving at a bank called the Sons and Daughters of Peace, Penny, Nickel, and Dime Savings Bank in Newport News. This is a black-owned bank founded by Reverend S.A. Howell, pastor of Wesley Grove Congregational Church. This historical black bank lasted from 1899 to 1931. Their sole mission was to help struggling blacks in the area save and reinvest in the community. You're going to hear a lot about this on this particular episode and throughout this podcast. There was a huge amount of support that black businesses had for each other if they saw that you had potential. Solomon's dance studio is really taking off as well. It's here you will find in Many, Texas, that he met his future wife, Mary, here at the dance studio. However, legend has it, Mary came from a checkered background, which would soon cause a huge rift between Solomon and his father. While Solomon is making ranks in Virginia, meanwhile there's the birth of John Edgar Hoover, also known as J. Edgar Hoover. What I found most interesting is, though he is documented to be born January 1st, 1895 in Washington, D.C., it should be noted that his birth certificate wasn't made public until 1938 at the age of 43. There are many that have their own theory as to when and where J. Edgar Hoover was really born and who were his actual parents. According to Mildred Millie McGee, author of Secrets, Uncovered J. Edgar Hoover, Passing for White, reveals through a collective oral and written history that J. Edgar Hoover was the product of an alleged affair. Trigger warning, the next few lines may be a bit unbearable to hear. According to McGee, the true lineage of J. Edgar Hoover begins with an African girl from the early 1800s. Her true identity and name were lost as she would become an enslaved girl at the age of 15 years old, with her name changed to Sarah Allen. Sarah was purchased by a man named Felix Allen in Pike County, Mississippi. Sarah and Felix gave birth to their daughter Elizabeth Allen, and Felix would later assault his own daughter Elizabeth, producing Emily Allen. Felix permitted a neighboring plantation owner named William Hoover to assault his daughter Elizabeth. Elizabeth and William produce John T. Hoover. William Hoover then purchases both Elizabeth and John T. Hoover. William and Elizabeth start a new life in D.C. as a white couple with their kid. So William Hoover is now married to Elizabeth Hoover, and they have their kid, John T. Hoover. The Allens and the Hoovers still have a very close relationship. Emily Allen, the daughter of Felix and Elizabeth, is later purchased by Christian Hoover Sr. Christian is the father of William Hoover, who is now married, as I mentioned, to Elizabeth. He has a second son, Christian Kit Hoover Jr. The father and son assault Emily at will. Eventually, Emily Allen, who is now married and her new name is Emily Hoover, produces Ivy Hoover, also known as Ivory, with Christian Hoover Jr. Remember John T. Hoover, the son of Elizabeth and William Hoover? John T. has a child with Cecilia Jane Hoover and had a kid named Dickerson Hoover. Dickerson Hoover marries a mixed-race woman named Annie Hoover. She is often written as Anna Marie Scheitlin Hoover, suggesting she may have been part German. According to the website Chime Hair Crush, Annie and Ivory hit it off and fell in love years ago when they lived on the plantation in Mississippi, suggesting that Annie was indeed an enslaved woman. If you're listening to this on audio, please go to the website at Podcast Higher Ground, and I do have a family tree picture to look at. Dickerson purchased her, and they also moved to D.C. to marry, which makes sense because Dickerson's father, John T., and grandfather, William Hoover, had already started new lives in D.C., so why not follow suit? The families, of course, stay in close contact, and while on a trip to Mississippi, Annie Hoover and Ivy Hoover rekindle their love for one another. Annie is technically Ivy's aunt, but only by marriage. During their most recent affair, they allegedly produced John Edgar Hoover in 1895 in Pike County, Mississippi. Though many historians place J. Edgar Hoover's birthplace in Washington, D.C., Dickerson Hoover is aware of the affair between Annie and Ivy, but stays put in the dad role, and at some point Annie moves in with Ivy. It's unclear whether Dickerson was left to tend with J. Edgar or if J. Edgar was brought to Mississippi to live or if he lived in D.C. Not 100% sure on that. But Dickerson Hoover eventually does suffer a mental breakdown and has to check into a mental institution. I guess perhaps the thought of being in a loveless marriage and raising a child that wasn't his was just far too much to bear. In his later teens, it would be revealed to Hoover that he is of mixed race. As a child, Hoover was a bit socially awkward and developed a stuttering problem. But that doesn't stop him from becoming a top-performing student. According to the 2012 book, The Secret Life of J. Edgar Hoover by Anthony Summers, Hoover was an applaudable debater and debated fiercely against the women's movement, abortion, and the women's right to vote, a constitutional law that would not be enacted until 1920. He earned the nickname Speed, describing his quick tongue and approach to overcome his stuttering problem while also delivering a glowing rebuttal. He attended Central High School in Washington, D.C., an all-white high school, and also navigated to the military training by joining the Reserve's Officers Training Corps program, otherwise known as ROTC. His social life is a bit awkward. He really doesn't make many friends. He spends most of his time reading and studying, and I suppose that really paid off because he later graduates as valedictorian of his high school class. Around 1916, at the age of 18, he lands his first job at the Library of Congress as a messenger filing clerk. Hoover focuses on advancing his education by taking night classes at the National University School of Law, now known as George Washington University School of Law, a law school that did not allow desegregation until 1954. Despite his reclusive style, Hoover seems to make an impression on the movers and shakers by joining a rather exclusive fraternity, the Kappa Alpha Order, founded in 1865 in honor of Confederate Civil War General Robert E. Lee and his values and mission. According to a New Yorker article featuring Beverly Gage, author of G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover, and the Making of the American Century, this fraternity is where Hoover gained entry to Washington's political elite. The senators, business owners, military personnel, the creme de la creme of Washington. Gage goes on to mention that, perhaps even more important, Kappa Alpha Order solidified the conservative racial outlook he would preserve with minor variations for the rest of his life. This group of men, self-appointed, proud, upstanding Americans, would later shape Hoover's vision in the FBI. Notable Kappa Alpha Order members include alumni such as Bill Samuels, founder of Maker's Mark Distillery, Zac Brown of the Zac Brown Band, comedian Bill Engvall, TV host Mark Wahlberg, and silver screen actor Anthony Perkins. Hoover obtained his Bachelor's of Law in 1916 and would later obtain his Master's of Law in 1917 at the age of 22. Now, you're probably wondering how someone obtains 2 law degrees by the age of 22. Well, until it was actively enforced in 1920, you didn't need a bachelor's degree as a prerequisite to a law degree at GWU School of Law. In late 1917, Hoover accepted a clerkship at the Department of Justice in the War Emergency Division and is soon appointed as the head of Alien Enemy Bureau by President Woodrow Wilson, a division created to seek out and intern German spies and register those that were legal. By age 22, Hoover has the power to sign off and disperse federal agents. Not only does this government position grant immense power to a 22-year-old, but also guarantees Hoover cannot be drafted into the war. And it is with this power that Hoover, allegedly, commits a heinous and unspeakable act, an act that he feels will finally pull his family back together. Around the time Lightfoot Mashaw was a child growing up, James Albert King and his wife, Delia Lindsay King, are present and working as sharecroppers in Clayton County, Georgia. When I first started this podcast, I wasn't going to mention the parents and grandparents of Martin Luther King Jr., But after giving it much thought, I found it prudent to include them in this podcast. Hearkening to the very title of this episode, sheds light on the predecessors of their family tree and reveals who helped to mold these influential figures. Many of us have done book reports and Black history reports on MLK, but what about MLK Sr. and his father? With that said, I'd like to share more on MLK's father and grandfather, who are often overlooked in history. It would appear as if preaching runs deep in the King family. According to nationalarchives.gov, Willis Williams, the grandfather of Martin Luther King, on King's mother's side of the family, was an enslaved man in Greene County, Georgia. He was also a preacher, but due to his status, he could not preach in a church, only in the field. Willis and his wife, Creasy, attended Shiloh Baptist Church, where, interesting enough, both enslaved and white congregated in the same church. This was highly unusual, but a true display of what worship should be, even in this day and age. Willis and Creasy would eventually have a son, Reverend Adam Daniel, also known as A.D. Williams, who would later pioneer the creation of the Atlanta chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. MLK's grandparents on his father's side were James and Delia King. They had 9 surviving children: Woody, Michael, who would later change his name to Martin, Lenora, Cleo, Lucille, James Jr., Ruby, Henry, and Jay. Eventually, the couple settled in Stockbridge, Georgia. To make ends meet, like many other rural Black families of this era, they turned to sharecropping. Black families couldn't get loans for land. If approved, they were subject to questionable lending practices, such as higher interest rates, mismanaged accounts, and institutions purposely withholding information on available grants and loans. These practices would eventually lead to foreclosure of Black-owned farms. On a brighter note, it also gave birth to such organizations such as the National Black Farmers Association, dedicated to providing meaningful tools of success for current and future farmers. This generational wealth hindrance forces many families to invest into sharecropping. In essence, they would lease an acreage of land, usually with a very small house on site, and cultivate the farmland, thus producing a yield of crops ranging from cotton, tobacco, dairy, and so on. The weight of your yield is determined by the terms of the lease agreement. Sharecropping was something the entire family participated in, so having that large family, like the Kings did, helped to ensure higher yields. James King Sr. struggles with alcoholism and was known to be a bit of a heavy-handed husband. His wife, Delia, was a religious woman, and even though James was not, he did not stand in the way of Delia taking her children to church and allowing Michael King to dabble in seminary. Michael King was a stocky young man. So as long as his Bible studies doesn't interfere with the crops, Dad's okay with it. They enrolled in Floyd Chapel Baptist Church in Stockbridge, Georgia, a historically Black church known to many as where Michael King received his calling. For Michael King's family, and for so many others, church was a form of escape from the harsh and brutal racial climate, and as a moment of pause from working those fields. According to the King Institute, Michael also attended the Stockbridge School for the Colored. He would later write that we had no books, no materials to write with, and no blackboard. But I loved going. While embracing his calling, He would hone his craft by giving sermons to the family chickens they had on the farm. In 1918, King moves to Atlanta, Georgia, with his sister Woody, who was an active church member of Ebenezer Baptist Church. Michael King views Reverend A.D. Williams as somewhat of a mentor and takes a more serious interest in his religious calling. King would vow to be a different type of preacher. He's seen the ugliness of Jim Crow, and even as a child, he witnessed the lynching of a black man walking home from work. He made himself a promise to use his pulpit to fight for justice and equality. After years of blistering his fingers in the field, he would now apply them to his Bible. His sister Woody plays matchmaker a little bit and introduces him to Reverend Williams' daughter, Alberta Williams, who takes a liking to Michael King. Alberta Williams also has a serious mindset of social change. Two people united by love and the desire to change the world. You could say a match made in heaven. While Michael King and J. Edgar Hoover were finding their way in the world, Solomon was facing challenges with his father. His new wife, Mary, also known to many as Blanche, was known by many to have worked in the seedy red light district in Newport News, often hanging around a bar called Grisham's. Little is known about Mary and her family, though she did occasionally speak very highly of her white father. Mary had a child from a previous marriage and married Solomon just after divorcing her husband. She rarely spoke of her ex-husband, and their child passed away, a heartbreaking end to motherhood. Once Mary became Mary Blanche Mishaw, it was understood that this marriage would be her rebirth. The loving couple purchased a 3-story home in Pinkett's Beach, Newport News, also known as Pinky's Beach, on Ivy Avenue in 1911. The acreage of land was owned by a black tailor named William Pinkett. Waterfront property was routinely denied to prospective black property buyers, so Pinky would sell small plots of his beach property to black buyers. Back then, as I mentioned, the black business community was a tight and well-connected fabric of people who wanted to see success for their peers. Mary would also play an instrumental part in shaping the church. She convinces Solomon to join the St. Timothy Church of Christ Holiness in Newport News. The Holiness movement was headed by founder Charles Price, known as also C.P. Jones, and Charles H. Mason. If you're looking to expand your footprint in the Christian church, C.P. Jones is certainly someone you want to attach yourself to. The Holiness Movement, or Holiness USA, in its early years was a non-denominational congregation. It is here Solomon would begin the blueprint of his foundation. Solomon is promoted to Treasury Secretary of his church, but his wife Mary wants more for him. She convinces him to build a church of his own, thus expanding the Church of Christ's footprint. Solomon's father is delighted to hear this and offers to kick in for the building expenses and seminary school. He encourages Solomon to attend the Virginia Baptist Seminary and College in Lynchburg, Virginia, and requests a promise that Solomon preaches as a Baptist. The Holiness Movement actually started as a breakaway group from the Methodists, and there are some old-timer Baptists like Solomon's father who are not quite brought into this movement yet. Mary fiercely objects to John's offer and wants her husband to stay in the Holiness Movement. She felt the Baptists have become too greedy, too wayward, and would not be a very good fit. They stick to the Church of Christ, and Mary even has the perfect place to start a church, Hopewell, Virginia, a booming little town developed by the DuPont Corporation, mainly manufacturing gun cotton. This town is filled with bars, illegal gambling, drunken soldiers from Fort Lee looking for a good old time, you name it. A modern-day Sodom and Gomorrah. So under the hospice of the Church of Christ Holiness, Solomon and Mary head to Hopewell, and there they build their very first church. Of course, money is very tight with the Holiness Church, so Solomon's got to invent his own way to erect this building using his own resources. Solomon knocks on the right doors, and the DuPont Corporation donates a sizable amount of land. A brother by the name of Brother Stiff is credited for building most of it with his own two hands, which Solomon is eternally grateful for. They named the church Everybody's Mission. Solomon turns to Reverend Handy from the Church of Christ in order to help him get more familiar with his Bible studies. Solomon is literally building a boat in the water, and now comes the hard part, getting people in the seats. Solomon is called to preach, but he is not yet ordained. He's still in the biblical studies phase. To make matters more interesting, he's not quite engulfed with the idea of being a full-time pastor. Meanwhile, Mary is mainly doing Bible lessons for members of the church and speaking engagements, though at first there aren't that many members just yet. Solomon's initial idea is to stay the course with his salesman mentality. He would treat Everybody's Mission as sort of a Live Nation type of venue. Solomon would invite well-known preachers to visit and draw the crowds. Visitors would either pay an entry or pay through their offerings, and the preacher would be paid through the offerings as well as the choir and the time it took to travel and things like that. So his plan actually starts to work out like gangbusters. Here he's gone from having the cleanest doorstep in town to a bustling little building of traveling congregants. Meanwhile, major corporations like DuPont are keeping a very close eye on the war. As treaties are being agreed upon, World War I is beginning to wind down, which puts Hopewell in a bad economic situation. Less fighting overseas means they need to adjust their hiring numbers. Hopewell is beginning to look hopeless. A pastor and his choir will gladly liven up the crowd. But where is the crowd? On top of it all, Solomon still has to operate his businesses and pay his mortgage. The golden child may have lost his golden touch. As described by a commentator, Dr. Hurst, Solomon may be suffering from a little founder's syndrome, which is not a mental condition as much as it is just getting in your own way. You're building something great, and you can feel it. And for some reason, you have those moments where you just freeze and refuse to acknowledge those changes, which could be the exact key performance indicators that will make you more successful. Solomon is persuaded by a parishioner and friend, Brother Diaz, to be a fisher of men. He's inspired to read the book of John, chapter 4, verse 35 to 36. Don't you have a saying? It's still 4 months until harvest. I tell you, open your eyes and look at the fields. They are ripe for the harvest. And now the one who reaps draws a wage and harvests a crop for eternal life, so that the sower and the reaper may be glad together. Solomon finally unlocks that quiet voice we all have in our minds that tells us to keep fighting. There are many who believe that Mary played a bit of reverse psychology on her husband. Though she wanted him to be a hosting church, She knew her husband had to lose in order to see the bigger picture. She could see that her husband grew somewhat arrogant. He needed to lose. He had to feel it for himself, to experience that feeling of defeat and uncertainty in order for Solomon to take himself more seriously and develop a thicker armor of God. Solomon finally became ordained in 1918 and preaches his very first sermon in Hopewell, Virginia. The crowd may have been small, but his passion was mighty. You see, a true salesman, a true showman, never sees a small crowd. He just sees a test audience. With the Hopewell, Virginia church floundering, the couple moved back to Newport News in the summer of 1918, with nothing much more than a tent and some apple boxes to stand on. They begin to grow their congregation. He pitches his tent and holds his first revival at the corner of 19th Street and Jefferson Avenue, asking for only 150 souls. These gospel tent meetings, as they were a way for him to also reintroduce himself as Elder Lightfoot Solomon Mashal, and has taken a liking to a new form of preaching that would later catapult his success: amateur portable radio. Unfortunately for him, by this time, World War I is ending. Soldiers are being sent home, and the military bases are shrinking. His lucrative government contracts have all but dried up. Not as many ships are being built at the shipyard, so the layoffs have an immediate negative effect on the locals and especially the black economy. Solomon could have just given up, but he doesn't. Eventually, he pulls together enough souls, roughly 156, to form a congregation and moves his church from a tent with a potbelly stove to a rented home not far from his home on 19th and Ivy Avenue. November 22nd, 1919, the Church of God was established. But this was not quite enough for Solomon. He knew he had more in store for himself. On the next episode of Podcast Higher Ground, experience the journey of Elder Lightfoot Solomon Mashal as he grows his influence as pastor of his new church, and where the elder learns the value of shaking the right hands, on Episode 2, Army of God, next week on Podcast Higher Ground.